All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. Sorry about that. Let me get everything situated. All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are reading Citizens, Cops, and Power. Kyle Rittenhouse got found not guilty today, and everybody's all up in a tizzy. Hope they had the same energy when somebody gets killed by the police here in Rockford. All right, Chapter 2. The Political Status of Community. Christy, a middle-aged, middle-class woman who resides in Eastside, is immensely disturbed by a young man who lives down the block. The young man lives with his mother and generates much neighborhood angst. He drives cars very fast down the street. He works noisily on those cars late at night. He welcomes many short-term visitors to his home, breeding suspicion that he is engaged in drug deals. At length, Christy discusses the young man's actions, how they disconcert her, and how she is responding. Asked at one point whether she feels influential in her neighborhood, she responds with an enthusiastic, quote, "Yep," end quote. When asked why, she says, quote, "Because I refuse to turn my head and stick my head in the sand and pretend that it's okay with what he's doing and it's not. And I will continue to fight because I own property here and he does not. And he has chased 6 neighbors away in the past 6 years. They just got fed up with it and can't handle it anymore. I'm about there myself," end quote. Note the speed with which Christy shifts from determination to despair. Indeed, later in the interview she says, quote, "I don't know. I'll probably end up moving," end quote. 6 years with the problem have taken a toll, and she admits the hopelessness. Discussions with other residents who face similar challenges reveal that she is not alone. I showed in Chapter 1 that urban residents, when asked to define community, discuss this social mode as a pattern of neighboring that can ensure feelings of security. Almost never did anyone suggest that community should be primarily about political activity. However, even if community is not primarily about politics, it is plausible that it could still sometimes serve that purpose, particularly with issues of crime and disorder. If neighbors are concerned about security, and if they have at least somewhat familiar relations, they might collectively thwart a perceived threat. They might be able to bear the political weight that community policing will place upon them. Might their shared concerns and connections be sufficient grounds for collective action? In the interviews, residents discuss security and whether their community could increase it. Like Christy, most residents express considerable pessimism about community as a vehicle to address matters of security. This doubt was voiced more loudly where economic distress and visible criminality were more commonplace. But it was a theme in middle-class neighborhoods as well. A surprisingly common set of concerns emerged around the political viability of community. These concerns underlay their pessimism. This despair obviously contradicts the rosy scenario often painted for small-scale democracy. The devolution of political authority should empower those closest to the ground dynamics. Because neighborhood residents know most about phenomena like crime in their midst, they are best equipped to devise strategies to reduce it. As a small-scale collective, they are also plausibly more likely than a larger group to engage in consensual, capacious decision-making. Such devolution is thereby arguably consonant with democracy. It is also frequently a component of projects consistent with neoliberalism. Though it is sometimes used in an overly broad fashion, neoliberalism describes efforts to reduce the role of the centralized state in economic and social affairs. Instead, social life is to be structured primarily by market forces. State projects are delegated to either private enterprises or voluntary institutions. Community often emerges in neoliberal governance as the recipient of some of the responsibilities for charity and security the state now eschews. Community policing exemplifies neoliberal efforts to devolve power in the name of increasing localized self-determination. My analysis leads me to add to the chorus of voices raising doubts about the ultimate sensibility of such devolution. While one can applaud increases in a citizen's sense of political agency, foregrounding community does not often accomplish this. It is easier to share the doubt expressed by the citizens of West Seattle about the prospects for political transformation through community. I explore this pessimism in this chapter. I move through 3 main sections. In the first, I review the 4 factors the residents cited the most frequently to explain the political lightness of community: individualism, heterogeneity, transience, and fear. Although these 4 issues emerge frequently, the interviews demonstrated that the severity of these challenges correlates with economic standing. Neighborhoods that are more disadvantaged suffer from these impediments more than do their more comfortable counterparts. Constraints face all neighborhoods that embrace self-governance, but they weigh more heavily on some. The significance of the unevenness of these constraints becomes more obvious in the second section, in which I review issues of representativeness and cultural capital. I recount residents' commentary about how leadership in neighborhood groups is often not representative of the group as a whole, in part because of the many requirements for success. The bureaucratic hurdles placed before communal groups are high and complex, and only certain citizens possess the ability to surmount them. As a result, particular residents emerge as leaders, residents who do not always reflect the composition of the group. Thus, the capacity for success might be geographically uneven because some neighborhoods house more residents with the necessary cultural capital. In the third section, I review the widespread sense that wealthier communities are indeed better able to make localized democracy work for them. And even where less advantaged communities do achieve success, it results from concentrating their attention largely upon small-scale matters. I therefore consider whether community governance can significantly impact the dynamics that most strongly shape those neighborhoods. All of this generates significant doubts about the political project of devolved authority. This provides cause again to wonder whether community is unbearably light. This will become clearer as we review each of the 4 most frequently cited impediments to communal political action. So that brings us to a changing of topic here in chapter 2, and so the main thing that I'm taking away from this is the lack of strength that certain communities have when it comes to the prospects of being able to implement political actions based off economic hindrances certain communities may have. A community that has been historically impoverished, a community that has historically had high unemployment rates, a community that has historically had high turnover in the people who live there is going to be in a lesser position to be able to have self-governance or to be able to self-governance in a community where people have generational wealth and people have owned these houses and passed the houses down from generation to generation, and where there hasn't been a lot of violent crime, and where there's good school systems in the neighborhood that people have generationally gone to, and there isn't high turnaround in the neighborhood. And so that's just some of and this really is just like an introduction to the chapter. So all right, let's keep moving on. The impediments to communal politics. Quote, people like to be left alone, end quote. Individualism and the demands of community. Urban residents want neighborly connections of just enough strength to guarantee predictability and reliability. This quest for security is understandable given the spatial interdependence that neighbors share. That these connections are not deeper is due in part to the valorization of individual autonomy. Just as there is a cultural warmth attached to community connection, so is there a resentment of the nosy neighbor. As much as Americans romanticize community, they also treasure freedom and autonomy. Between these two extremes, connections of basic familiarity seem a sensible middle position, a balance between group togetherness and individual freedom. The American valorization of individualism is a frequent source of communitarian complaint. To the extent that Americans primarily engage themselves in projects of self-fulfillment or material advantage, they may well diminish the moral fabric of their collective. While this complaint can be criticized for naively yearning after a vanished time when notions of community were allegedly more regnant, it was one echoed by many of those interviewed. Recall Andrew, quoted at the beginning of Chapter 1, waxing nostalgic about how there, quote, was such an involvement, end quote, in the neighborhoods of his past, how, quote, everybody knew everybody, end quote, in his days of yore. However, often the respondents indulged in such nostalgic cravings, they more commonly suggested that this state of relations is no longer possible or even desirable. They may want neighborly connections, but not at the expense of their interdependence. Said Walter, a resident of a beach neighborhood, when asked whether he lived in what he considered a community, quote, it's kind of a community of individualists. People, you know, it's a community. The beach focus is what really kind of, I think, glues people together. Whether they're friends with each other, that's another matter, end quote. Later in his interview, he indicated that political organizing was quite rare in his area, only occurring once or twice in his nearly 25 years of residence. In his neighborhood, close connection and formal organization were not the norm. While only Walter used the term, quote, community of individualists, end quote, his description of the loose connections that bind him to his neighbors was common. Overly tight relations would inevitably be too constraining, the respondents indicated, an unwanted intrusion into one's business. A desire for individual autonomy limited the depth of neighborhood interactions. Individualism created barriers to communal involvement. This was frequently noted by community organizers. They said their neighbors were otherwise engaged and thus often reluctant to participate. Here's Richard, a neighborhood watch leader in a middle-class community in Westside. I think generally people like to be left alone to their own devices. They feel that if they involve themselves in the community, there's going to be a commitment that they don't want to give. I guess there's always a sense of, quote, oh, it's going to cost me, end quote. Well, really, it's not going to cost you. All I'm asking you to do is to say hello to your neighbor or keep an eye on the street if you're out there. That's all I need you to do. I'm not asking for you to cough up $100 a month to pay for private security or anything. Just be a little bit more involved and just make people feel like they are a part of the block or a part of the community, and just say hello and make people feel comfortable and secure in the knowledge that, hey, I can count on you to at least watch my house. Andrew, also a watch leader in a middle-class neighborhood in Midlands, made much the same point. Well, I think it's an attitude of like, I don't really want to get involved, and I have to be guilty. I do that too. I don't want to be involved. I'm busy. I have my family to take care of. I'm self-sufficient. I know what I want. I know where I'm going. I throw my arms around my family first before I actually go out and do something for somebody else. I think everybody is sort of guilty. It's just an American thing generally. The notion that a desire for individualism was rooted in American culture was expressed most directly by Nelson, a resident of Blufftop, who was raised in a small African village. In his childhood, he knew well all of those who surround him. The contrast with neighboring in the United States was striking. But in this country, what I've seen is this culturally kind of individualism, which is good in some cases, but it is also not good in some cases. And it is very hard for you to live here and know your next door neighbor in that sense. This emphasis on individualism was expressed invariably and valuably by those who tried to lead neighborhood activities. Many of these activists recognized that efforts to increase involvement cannot be pushed very far before their neighbors will refuse to be drawn in further. Even if there is considerable enthusiasm at one point to act as a group, this often diminishes over time. Here's Christy again. Every once in a while, down here at the community center, They have community meetings for the area. And because every neighborhood, every block has a different complaint, you hear so many. And a lot of them complain about the drug activity. This area is just nasty with drug activity. But when we go down to the meetings, we get to see other people in other neighborhoods. Yeah, we need to get together and talk about this. But you never do. Nobody ever finds the time. And lately, the last one was over a month ago. All new faces. There's some of the old faces, but mostly they're all new faces. And they're people. Oh, we're new to the neighborhood. We're going to make a change. Well, yeah, go ahead. Give it a try. When you figure out the magic words, let me know, because I'm going to do it in my neighborhood. Efforts to create cohesive neighborhood political organizations often lack the right, quote, magic words, end quote, to surmount the predisposition to individualism. For many residents, concerns for oneself and one's immediate family impeded collective action. Often, the demands of daily life were too overwhelming to allow time for neighborhood politicking, said Frida, a retired middle-class homemaker, when asked why she did not join her neighborhood group. Because I'm tired. It gets to be too much. It's just meetings all the time. So everything you join, you have to commit your time to. And right now, I love the garden. And I go up at the church and weed around the flowers there and help out a neighbor or two around here. So when you are in all these clubs, you don't have time for that. So that's why I have it seems like I'm active in too many things as it is. Many activists empathize with this complaint, particularly when describing the circumstances of those less economically advantaged. If Frida, retired and economically comfortable, struggles to find time to be active in neighborhood matters, imagine the challenges for those who struggle to avoid penury. Lane, the head of a community crime prevention organization, recognized the difficulty for many citizens in West Seattle of engaging it. You too. Have a good evening. Good night. What up, bro? How you feeling? What up, man?
Smoke.
Yeah. Oh, damn, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. What up, bro? How you feeling, man?
Man, I'm good, man. Hey, keep.
You already know, bro. You already know.
What you reading?
It's called Citizens, Cops, and Power about community policing.
How much does that cost you?
Somebody donate. People donate all the books.
Yeah. There's books?
Yeah. In that brown box right there, there's a bunch of them.
You mind if I
Go ahead. That's what they're here for.
Enjoy it. It's Tridary.
Thank you.
It's about like 29.
Okay.
It's 29%. It's the sativa.
Okay. It tastes good. It's nice.
Yeah, it's nice. It's good. I'll keep coming by giving you a joint.
Thank you.
You.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
It's the least
No,
I
I'm
can
already knowing.
I
That's what
used
we
to-
stay for. That's why we
When
stay.
I could, I would donate food and drinks.
Yeah. That's why we
but,
stay.
I got weed right now. That's
No,
what I got to give
that works.
you.
That
You
works
know,
for
that's
real.
all
That
I got.
works.
I'll bring you some of my books.
Okay, thank you. That
And
works.
Mysteries. I don't know if you'd want to read them, but I'm really
fun.
into psychological thrillers.
Yeah, we're gonna stay. Yeah, we take shifts though. Different people come at different times, but we're gonna stay. We're gonna be here.
Okay.
Yep.
Either way, I'll just be bringing by.
We'll be here. Yeah.
Some shit. All I have to offer is weed.
No, that's fine. Whatever.
I know it's not the greatest, but it gets the mood.
No, whatever is offered is good. It's good.
It'll help you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. No, we got multiple copies of that one. Go ahead, take that. Yeah, for sure, bro. Yeah.
Here's a lighter.
Thank you. Yep. Have a good night.
Good night, Leslie.
Yep. Have a good night. Good seeing y'all again. Be safe. Love y'all. Damn, I want to delete all the last 3 minutes of this recording. Okay, that last segment got ended a little abruptly. Sorry about that. Some people came by. We are outside of the City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. Day 400 and something. So let's just reflect on what we were reading about, and it was really hinged a lot on individualism in in neighborhoods and individualism and in locales and the challenges that having building political power has in neighborhoods because of the idea of individualism and because of how individualism works, and even how community governance, that's one of the things that Steve Herbert continues to come to, why community governance is a difficulty, is because of the type of individualism that is pushed into society. And that has been a common issue throughout multiple things that we have read, how individualism in the society is damaging to struggling against certain things, because these institutions prey upon individualism. They rely upon individualism for them to continue to function in the manner in which they function. So that's one of the main things that I'm just getting away from this too, is just how in the different ways that individualism can be hindrances to some of the greater goods. Okay. Man, I don't even remember exactly where we stopped at. Many activists empathize with this complaint, particularly when describing the circumstances of those less economically advantaged. If Frida, retired and economically comfortable, struggles to find time to be active in neighborhood matters, imagine the challenges for those who struggle to avoid penury. Lane, the head of a community crime prevention organization, recognized the difficulty for many citizens in West Seattle of engaging in efforts to increase security. Some of them frequently work 2 or 3 jobs where they don't have a neat 9-to-5 schedule, where they have the rest of the time to be involved in the community and to meet other people. I mean, it's harder for them if they are working a different schedule that is not in that neat 9-to-5 category to be active and involved in neighborhood meetings. Jean, another activist in a mixed income neighborhood in Eastside, echoed the theme. Quote, I think you start losing some of the community because people are, perhaps, concentrating on working to get by, end quote. In short, the pursuit of individual aims constrains organizing in all neighborhoods, but impacts some more severely. In neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage, organizers face the Sisyphean task of recruiting participants for whom political action seems a luxury that time and circumstances do not permit. These citizens, then, made clear that neighborhood cohesion is as frustrated as individuals engage in matters. These citizens then made clear that neighborhood cohesion is frustrated as individuals engage in matters other than community building. Activists seek the, quote, magic words, end quote, to coalesce their neighborhoods, but recognize the intractability of the cultural predisposition to individualism. Individual pursuits, even basic economic security, often trump localized political activity. A similar challenge to community political action is posed by heterogeneity, which also possesses an uneven geography and hence an uneven effect on community organizing. Okay, that brings us to a changing of the sort of the theme of this chapter. And that main theme was, again, just individualism and how individualism is a hurdle and a difficulty for community governance. Okay, quote, a huge barrier, end quote, the constraint of heterogeneity. And I think I'm pronouncing that right. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. One of the common critiques of community is its inherent exclusivity. To define a group necessarily requires a demarcation between those who belong and those who do not. For many commentators, this demarcation can reactivate in defensive an attempt to attain a group purity that reinforces social differences. These differences, many note, are increasingly inscribed directly in the landscape, as well as the advantage seek protection from those against whom they define themselves. Indeed, one can argue, following McConnell, that the more local the group, the greater the likelihood of homogeneity. In well-defined communities, a more inclusive polity cannot form. Walled off from those they fear, the prosperous elude responsibility for the wider public. If community is invoked as a defense of these practices, then its pursuit becomes a suspect political project. For citizens in West Seattle, difference was indeed experienced as a constraint on the pursuit of community, yet what they expressed was not so much a defensive posture against those who were different as a frustration with how difference interfered with simple communication and deeper forms of connection. It is, of course, entirely possible that the respondents stifled expressions of discomfort with social groups different from themselves for fear of disappropriation. However, many of them, particularly those who expressed genuine interest in cross-group organizing, found heterogeneity a complicated matter, and the severity of the challenge that heterogeneity presents is not felt uniformly across space, because the degree of democratic difference is uneven across urban space and aligns directly with economic class. Its effects on political organizing are also uneven. Where people sought to unite their neighbors, they were frustrated when linguistic and other cultural differences asserted themselves. Residents did not indicate that they believed that difference needed to be exercised from the community. Instead, they suggested that simple lines of communication could not be opened. The following excerpt, for example, comes from Jean, a middle-aged, middle-income white woman who is married to an African American and is the president of her neighborhood association. She seems genuinely eager to engage her neighbors of Asian and Latino backgrounds, but does not quite know how. I think one of the major things I've seen, and again, I've lived here probably 7 years, but really didn't get a good feel for the neighborhood until maybe the last 3 years. Language is a huge barrier. Language is a huge barrier. Kids learn the English language, but they don't necessarily communicate with their parents what their schools are asking them to communicate, so their parents aren't exactly aware of what's going on. Throughout her interview, Jean circled back to the intractable issue of communication. She mentioned the need to print up flyers for community meetings in different languages to try to diversify the gathering. Left unaddressed was how communication would proceed if representatives from all the neighborhood's linguistic groups were present. Others active in community-based efforts to combat crime frequently mentioned the need to communicate with those who spoke different languages. They regularly stressed, for instance, the importance of advertising the fact that the police's emergency call system employs operators who speak different languages so that no one would hesitate to call the police. You shouldn't call the police. Don't call the police. The fact that neighborhood activities were invariably conducted in English and generally presumed a basic familiarity with the operations of state agencies, such as the police, understandably limited the involvement of groups without those capacities. As a consequence, those populations were largely invisible to many activists. As D, the head of an East Side Neighborhood Watch group, put it, I guess I'd have to guess that the population in my neighborhood, is predominantly white. But I would also say that there's a really good chance that that is not true, and that because I just don't, the folks that are not white, in my experience, tend to not get involved in the community action committees or block watch groups or, for whatever reason. The non-whites in her neighborhood are thus not entirely visible to this community leader. Further, she cannot explain their absence. Hold on, give me 1 second. I want to see where this breaks down. Okay. Okay, let's keep on going. Part of the problem, perhaps, is that cultural differences are more than just linguistic. Nora, an Eastside resident active in neighborhood watch activities, expressed her frustration with trying to make connections with her neighbors of Asian heritage. I think there are some cultural barriers with some of the Asian families that make it difficult to communicate with them, or them to feel, I don't know what they really understand what block watch is all about. So being able to have an interpreter that will be able to explain that to them. And then there are just, I don't know. I have personal hang-ups about about the roles that women from Asian countries get put into. And so mom always being at home cooking and cleaning is really difficult because I would love to go over and, and chat or meet them, and there's not really that opportunity. And when I've tried that with some of the men in the family, I really don't get much of a response from them. And I assume that it's because I'm female. But, I don't know if that's true. It might just be them. But I do think cultural differences like that make it challenging. The intractability of cultural differences was noted in nearly every community where heterogeneity existed. Such heterogeneity was most pronounced in Blufftop, the large-scale public housing facility in Midlands. It was not uncommon for up to 6 different language interpreters to attend public meetings there, a noteworthy attempt to ensure that all could be engaged. However, this did little to break down the barriers between these groups, said Dan and Heather, an American Indian couple of long residents. Dan: no, they stick to their own groups. The only people that mix with each other are. Heather: the Vietnamese always stick together. The Samoans always stick together with their own group. Filipinos stick with their own groups. These people, Somalis, stick with their own, and this other. And all the blacks got their own. The American blacks have their own. For some, disjunctures between cultures are not just challenges, but sources of ongoing tension. In one particularly distressed Centralia neighborhood, relations between African Americans and Latinos were often antagonistic, as Darla and Jocelyn, 2 young black females, explained. Interviewer: so you said the Mexicans and the blacks on street name don't get along? Darla: no. Interviewer: why is that? Jocelyn: because they think that sometimes the blacks have like music outside, they get mad, but when they be having their music out, we don't care. They be having their music. Darla: they think we're taking over, but we lived here first. They just started coming because everybody moved out. Such clashes also took a violent form in this neighborhood. Both residents and the police traced several homicides in the area to battles between ethnically based gangs. A clear narrative of what prompted this violence was elusive. Battles over control of the drug trade were often cited, as were disputes over women. But these groups were ethnic-based and provided the most striking reminder that cultural distinctions were significant. What clouds this picture further is that outsiders cannot recognize that most groups possess internal divisions as well. Nelson expressed discomfort that all Africans in Blufftop were yoked together, despite their considerable internal variation. Nelson: no. Within East Africans, maybe, there is some kind of underneath. It's not something that you can see if you are not a person who is a part of it. But it never comes to affect anything or create any disturbance or anything. But maybe they are not. A little bit they might not feel happy about each other. In that sense, yeah. But of course, like an East African and a Southeast Asian, no problem, there was nothing. Interviewer: the internal tension? And is that between people from Somalia and people from Ethiopia? And Nelson: no, I think maybe within people from Ethiopia. Like, for example, there's the Eritrean and Ethiopians, which is traditionally or culturally connected in some way. And because of a war they had back home, created an atmosphere kind of thing. And I think even within Somalia, maybe there's some kind of problem that they have in their country that they might play some role over here. Similarly, Meg, an African American resident of Centralia, explained what happened to her when she chastised other blacks for stealing the tools of a white neighbor. After she told them the stealing reflected poorly on, quote, all of us, end quote, she was strongly criticized. Oh boy, why did I say that? They called me a sellout. I was called everything but a child of God, a traitor, to the race. I said, hold on, wait a minute, hold up. I don't play that. Wrong is wrong. I don't care what the colored person is. When it's wrong, it's wrong. Don't do that to me. Differences within and across groups, then, impede the creation of political ties in urban communities. Given its correlation with economic disadvantage, heterogeneity's impact on organizing is unevenly felt. At a later point in her interview, Jean described this challenge in her efforts to organize in her neighborhood. But because I think of the lower to middle class families and the diversity, it's hard to recognize it as one community. Lots of our cultural differences and people tend to stay in their own little separate entities. So it's hard to bring all the communities together to make one big community. Heterogeneity and class combine to make elusive genes work at cohesive political community. The struggle to establish connections across and between different linguistic, cultural, and ethnic groups was regularly cited by residents as a principal impediment to the community cohesion they thought was necessary for political capability. In the next section, I consider transience, which was viewed as similarly detrimental. And then that will be the ending of this Rockford Reading Daily episode. This was a interesting episode. We had a little interruption there, but I think that the main things I take away from this first parts of this chapter is the impediments of individualism and then the impediment of heterogeneity to creating community within neighborhoods and community within locales and communities within a certain block radius. And I also, one of the things that I think about is how many different how many different neighborhoods I've grown up in. Sorry about that. I hate when I yawn I hate yawning in the mic. I'm sorry about that. How many different neighborhoods I've grown up in where there were people from where it was a Mexican family that lived across the street, and a white family that lived down the street, and then some African immigrant family that lived up the street, and black family, down the corner, and white family, and that does make it so that you have to be able to, before you can even come together for any type of common good in a neighborhood area or in a locale area, overcome whatever differences you may have, or at least confront the prejudices you may have about people from other cultures, about people from other communities, before you can begin to form a separate community or form this big community. And so I think that's again where the importance of understanding of putting an emphasis on racial injustice, which we have done here, comes into play. And I think that a lot of some of these concepts, these human concepts of community, human concepts of heterogeneity, human concepts of individualism, understanding all of those things gets us to a place of being able to understand how these institutions manipulate these human concepts for profit and manipulate these human concepts for gain. And once we can articulate these concepts, and once we can articulate how these concepts are manipulated, and how some of these things that we just take for granted, or some of these things that we just only see on the surface level. Community is something we recognize only on the surface level. Individualism on the surface level. Heterogeneity on the surface level. Culture is something that people use the word on in such a loose term, but it's something that they really only recognize a lot of times on the surface level. And it's once we begin to dissect those things on a deeper level that we get to a place of being able to utilize them as instruments in this struggle that we are waging. And so those are the things, some of the things I'm taking away from what we just read. So we're going to end this episode of Rockford Reading Daily. Again, we're reading Citizens, Cops, and Power by Steve Herbert. We're on chapter 2, bottom of page 49. I think this is probably the longest book that we've read. It's about 140 pages, 150 pages. I'm trying to keep the books a certain size for these Rockford Reading Daily, so that way we're not hung up on one book for like 2 months or nothing. All right. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen. Please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We will be back tomorrow. I know this was a longer episode. Thanks for bearing with us. We outside.